A good Chodesh, a good Erev Shabbos. Today we are learning Perek Gimel of Maseches Challah, and here we go. Today's shiur is sponsored Lilei Nishmas Aaron Nachum ben Simcha HaKohen and Yeshua Mordechai ben Shepsel Baruch Asar Bashmo Leib and Binyamin Moshe ben Yosef ben Lashas Alhav Aliyah. And starting today, this first week of Kislev is also sponsored by the New York State Chaplain Group. Thank you for your sponsorship. Mishnah Perek Gimel Mishnah Aleph. Here we go. So there are two stages. The Mishnah is gonna the Mishnah as an introduction. There's two stages in the dough making process regarding the challah obligation. The first stage is when the flour is mixed with water, as we'll see in this Mishnah. But before that point, before the flour hits the water, there's no requirement to set to mafish challah, and the grain may be eaten without any restrictions. Um, Once that stage is reached, separating challah is effective because there's the water now hit the flour, now you're forming a dough. Um, the second stage, where the gemar malacha, when you finish processing the dough, which you can define what that exact moment is, that's then the dough is then considered tevel until it is mafish challah from it, and you cannot eat it while it's still tevel. So we're going to talk about that now. Ochlin arai min isa, we may eat casually from a dough. Ashet is galgal bechitim until it is completely kneaded. In the case of dough from wheat, v'titamim v'tim v'titamtam b'sorim, or until it is packed together. In the case of barley dough, gilgala b'chitim v'timtima b'sorim. However, once she has completed its kneading, in the case of wheat dough, or packed it together in the case of barley dough, the one who eats from it without first separating challah is chayav misa b'idei shamayim. Once the wheat dough is completely kneaded, or the barley dough is packed together, it had its gemar malacha, it's finished processing, and therefore it's chayav challah. Someone who eats it after it's been finished processing is chayav misa b'idei shamayim. Okay, so don't do this at home. As soon as she puts the water into the flour, into the kneading bowl, magbahas chalasa. She separates its challah even for the flour that did not yet mix with the water. As long as some of it mixed, so it didn't, you can still be mafish challah. As long as there are not 5 run with dry flour remaining there in the kneading bowl. I mean, if the amount of flour that was not yet mixed is less than 5 ribboim, and the challah separation is effective not only for the flour that has already been mixed, but also for the unmixed flour that's still in the bowl. Mishnah Beis. Nidma isasa ach lo gugula. If her dough became a duma, meaning that produce of truma was mixed into it before she completed its kneading, before the dough became chayiv and challah, Petura, then even after she completes kneading it, it remains pater from challah. Meduma pater, because meduma, when it's a cross between truma and chulin, that is pater from challah, because once you gave truma on it, you don't need to give challah on it. But if her dough became a duma after she completed its kneading, which is after it was already chayiv and challah, chayeves, then it remains chayiv and challah even though it's not a duma. No la stavi tuma. If there arose a doubt that perhaps the dough became tummy, it depends on the following. Aj lo gugula, if the doubt arose before she completed its kneading, before it became subject to Challah, Teyaseh B'Tumah, it may then be prepared in Tumah in a way that it will become definitely Tameh. But if the doubt arose after she completed its kneading, when it had already become obligated in Challah, Teyaseh B'Tahara. It must be prepared in Tahara. She must continue to make sure that it does not have any contact with Tumah. Although the dough is already possibly Tameh, it is forbidden to make it definitely Tameh once it has become subject to the Challah obligation. Mishnah Gimel. Higdisha isasa ad shelo gilgala upadata. If she consecrated her dough to the base of Mikdash before she completed its kneading, meaning before the point where it becomes subject to Challah, upadata, and she redeemed it right away before she completed its kneading process. Chayeves, then it is subject to the Challah obligation when she completes its kneading, even though we know that dough that is hektish is part of Challah, this dough is no longer hektish when its kneading was completed, and therefore it's chayiv in Challah. But if she consecrated the dough only after she completed its kneading, in which case it had already become chayiv in Challah, and she then redeemed it, chayeves, it remains subject to the chiyuv of Challah. If she consecrated it before she completed its kneading, before it became chayiv and Challah, the Gilgala Hagizbar and the temple treasurer completed its kneading, and then she redeemed it. Petura, it is exempt from Challah. Reason for this is because at the time of its obligation, it was pater, since it belonged to hektish. Since the dough was exempt from challah when its kneading was completed, it remains pater even after it's redeemed. Mishnah Dalet, Kiyotzi. Similarly, if someone consecrated his fruits before they reached the time of Maisvus, Upadan, and then redeemed them while they still have not reached the time of Maisvus, Chayavin, they are Chayiv in the they are still Chayiv in Meiser, because when the Meiser obligation took effect, they were no longer hektish. But so too, if he was makdish them after they reached the time of Meiser and then redeemed them, chayav, and they are still chayiv in Meiser, because here too, the produce was not hektish when the processing was completed. Therefore, it became subject to Meiser first before it became hektish, and this obligation remains in effect even if the produce was then makdish and then redeemed. Because the Meiser obligation fell first. If, however, he consecrated them before the processing was complete, and the Beis Hamikdash, the official, completed their processing, and the owner then redeemed them, they are exempt from Meisus. Because at the time of their obligation, they were consecrated and therefore exempt from Meisus. Therefore, even if they are then redeemed, they remain exempt from Meisus. Okay, Mishnah Hey. If a non-Jew gave flour to a Jew to make a dough for the non-Jew, the two of them in the challah, the dough is part of challah because it belongs to the non-Jew. Nashtalo matana. If the non-Jew gave this dough as a gift to the Jew, was preparing the dough, then it depends. Chalo Gilgil, if the non-Jew gave the dough to the Jew before the Jew completed kneading the dough, Chayiv, then the Jew is obligated to be mafresh challah when he completes kneading the dough, because the dough is owned by a Jew when the challah obligation takes effect. Mr. Gilgal, however, if the non-Jew gave the dough to a Jew after he completed kneading the dough, so remain the goys throughout the whole process of kneading, Potter, then he is exempt from challah because it still belonged to the non-Jew at the time the challah obligation took effect. Ha'osa Isa if a Jew makes a dough together with a non-Jew, meaning that each one owns part of the dough, shiur challah. The law is that if the portion owned by the Jew does not contain the minimum measure subject to the challah obligation, the term challah, then the dough is pater from challah. Although the entire dough contains 5 of flour, the portion of the dough that is owned by the non-Jew is not counted toward the minimum measure chayiv and challah, since the portion owned by the Jew by itself does not contain the minimum measure for the challah obligation. It is not chayiv to challah. Mishnah Vav. Gersh and his Gayer, if someone converted to Judaism, Isa, and he owned a dough, and then the law is like this: Nasis Ashlo, this Gayer, if it was completed before he converted, Pater, he is Pater from Bima from Challah because it belonged to a non-Jew when the Challah obligation took effect. Mission this Gayer, however, if the dough is completed after he converted, Chayev, he is chayiv to separate challah from it because he was a Jew when the challah obligation took effect. And if it is uncertain whether the dough was made before he converted or afterwards, chayiv, he is obligated to separate challah from it, since there is a doubt whether the dough is subject to the challah obligation. We must deal with it strictly and separate challah. They ain't chayiv chomish, but if non-Kohanim unlawfully ate this challah that was separated out of doubt, they are not chayav to pay an additional fifth on account of eating it, because we're not going to put that knas on him. Rabbi Akiva says, "Hakol holich acher akrima b'tanur." It is entirely dependent on the time of the formation of a crust in the oven. Whether a convert is obligated to separate challah from his dough does not depend on whether he was Jewish at the time of the kneading of the dough. Rather, it depends on when the dough formed a crust in the oven. Mishnah Zayin. Ha'osa isa min achitin u min ha'orez. If a person made dough from a mixture of wheat flour and rice flour, then if the flavor of the wheat grain can be tasted in the dough, it is chayav and challah. Similarly, a person can fulfill his obligation to eat matzah on Pesach with matzah made from it. If the flavor of the wheat grain cannot be tasted in the dough, it is not chayiv in challah. And the person cannot fulfill his obligation to eat matzah on Pesach with matzah made from it. Okay, Mishnah Ches. We continue. Hanotel shar seor meisa shelo vermachalasa. If someone takes a piece of sourdough from a dough whose challah has not yet been separated, the noistin l'soch isa shehur machalasa, and mistakenly puts that sourdough into a dough whose challah has already been separated, thereby creating a mixture of dough of chulin and dough of tevel. Then the following should happen. If he has a batch of flour to bring from somewhere else, which together with the sourdough contains the minimum 5 volume, a measure of flour that is subject to challah. Then he kneads the flour into dough and joins the two batches of dough together. Then he separates an amount of challah from the new dough in proportion to the amount of tevel in both doughs together. And then he separates 1/24 of the amount from the new dough. By doing so, he potters the sourdough and removes its tevel status. And then the original dough will now be permitted to in its entirety. In love, if he does not have another batch of flour from which to make a new dough, motzi challah achas al, he must separate one full measure of challah, 1/24 of the dough from within the dough and sourdough mixture itself, for the entire mixture of dough and sourdough. You need to take 1/24 of it. Okay, Mr. Tess. Kiyotzivo. Zeise meisik shinis arvu in zeise nikuf. Similarly, with regard to harvested olives that became mixed with pickled olives, two different types of olives. Inve batzir inve olalus, or harvested grapes that are tevel that became mixed with olalus grapes, which are left as for the poor. Then he can do the following. If he has a batch of tevel of the same type of produce that he can bring from somewhere else, he may separate an amount of maisvus from the batch of tevel in proportion to the amount of tevel in the mixture. In love, if he does not have another batch of tevel from which to separate maisvus for the tevel in this mixture, he must separate the amount of truma and trumas maisvus necessary for the entire mixture and give those portions to the kohen. Shar Meiser Meiser Sheni the three cheshvan. And as for the remaining meisers of Meiser Rishon Meiser Sheni, the amounts of fruit he treats as meisers in proportion to the amount of tevel in the olives or a grape mixture. And finally, Mr. Yud, Hanotel Seor Isas. If someone takes a piece of sourdough from the wheat dough of tevel, then knows the soch isas oris and places it in a rice dough, which is not challah. In yeshba tamdaga, if the flavor of the wheat grain can be tasted in the dough, chayeres b'challah, the entire mixture is chayev in challah. In love, petura, but if the flavor of the wheat grain cannot be tasted in the dough, it is pater from challah. The sourdough is nullified in the majority of chul and rice dough, and there's no requirement at all to separate challah. Okay, and this is so that the tevel sourdough forbids the rice dough only if the flavor of the sourdough can be tasted. Lama amru tevel oser kosher. Regarding what case did the Chachamim say that tevel forbids a mixture even in a small amount? Min bimino, they said regarding a mixture of they said regarding a mixture of food, not blood, food, of one kind with its own kind, as in the case of Mishnah 8, of Mishnah Ches, where both the sourdough and dough are made of wheat. In that case, the mixture is prohibited even if the tevel cannot be tasted. But regarding a mixture of a food of one kind with an unlike kind, since it's the case of our Mishnah, then the law is that tevel prohibits only when it gives taste to the mixture. That's the end of Perek Gimel. We will continue on Sunday morning, Mitzvah Hashem, with Perek Dalet as we wrap up the Shnayos Challah. Have a wonderful Shabbos and Kol Tov and a good Chodesh.